The Olympics are built on speed, power, precision. And yet, in the middle of the most high-stakes sporting competition on Earth, elite athletes are knitting. Why are some of the most elite athletes on the planet turning to one of the slowest crafts imaginable? Part of the answer lies in the nervous system, but the part that nobody's talking about lies in the algorithm. The Olympics are 1% competition and 99% waiting. When we tune in on our television, we see that one iconic dive, that amazing gold medal run, but what we don't see is the hours and days leading up to the competition. It all comes down to one race, one moment under the lights, and the rest of the time, you wait. Between events in the village, in the dining hall, your body is in a near constant state of fight or flight, but you can't burn it off just yet. You have to sit in that tension until it's your turn to compete. If you don't give your brain something to actively focus on in the days leading up to your competition, it will fixate on every what if, on every mistake from practice, on all the people who made sacrifices to get you here. So in some ways, the hardest part isn't the competition. That's the moment you've trained for. The hardest part is managing the waiting. And that's where knitting comes in. It's almost perfectly engineered to fill that gap. It's portable and tactile. It's absorbing, but not draining. It gives you a way to visualize success in a way that has nothing to do with run times. You're measuring in rows, not degrees of rotation. You can't control where you're sleeping, what you're eating, who your competitors or even your judges are, but you can just knit one more row. And maybe most importantly, it's not your phone. It's really hard to doom scroll while you're knitting. So you don't get caught up in the commentary and competitors' posts and the flood of messages from back home, even what's being posted about you. It's completely analog. And in an environment that's built on adrenaline, knitting is a way to slow down without shutting down. Let's talk about what's actually happening inside the body, because when you're knitting, there are three mechanisms that are almost perfectly suited for the Olympics. The first is something called the relaxation response. In the 1970s, a Harvard cardiologist named Herbert Benson identified something he felt was the physiological opposite of fight or flight. If fight or flight is adrenaline, elevated heart rate, cortisol flooding your system, the relaxation response is what brings everything back down. And one of the most reliable ways to trigger it is repetitive rhythmic motion. Think prayer beads, focusing on your breath, or even knitting. When your hands find a steady rhythm, your nervous system follows. Your heart rate lowers, your breaths slow, cortisol drops. It slowly brings you back to baseline. And that's exactly what athletes need in between events, a way to gently settle without shutting down. The second mechanism is flow. Psychologist Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi described flow as that state where you're fully absorbed in an activity. And it requires that activity to not be too challenging or not be too easy. You can get completely absorbed in an activity because you're not bored, but you're not frustrated either. Knitting is uniquely good at this. A beginner knitter might get fully absorbed in something simple like stockinette stitch. A more advanced knitter might find flow knitting complex cables or lace. The important thing is that knitting can fully occupy your mind so you don't have space for rumination or focus on your worries, but it still doesn't drain or exhaust you. This brings us to the third mechanism, and this one is less talked about. Knitting's rhythmic repetitive motion requires you to use both hands in tandem, and that kind of bilateral activity shows up in a lot of calming activities like walking and breath work and rocking. There are even some similarities to the type of bilateral stimulation used in EMDR therapy, a type of trauma therapy that uses eye movements and tapping. Researchers are still debating why this type of left-right stimulation has a calming effect, but initial studies suggest that it may help support processing and reduce emotional intensity. Now, knitting is not therapy, but the comparisons are worth noting. And although no one has run a clinical trial on athletes in the Olympic Village, what they share in their anecdotes aligns almost perfectly with what the research predicts. Tom Daley went viral for knitting at the Tokyo Olympics in 2021, and the media treated it like a quirky hobby, but the way that Tom described it, as calming, as mindful, as grounding, sounds like more than just a cute hobby. That sounds like regulation. There's something else about knitting that's harder to capture in a brain scan, and it's the experience of learning something new. A few years ago, I learned how to snowboard as an adult. I jokingly say that I have cried across beautiful mountains all over the Northeast, and despite the difficulty and the physical pain of learning how to snowboard, I kept going back. It was a unique and exhilarating experience to wake up in the morning not able to turn left on a snowboard and realize by the end of the day I could. And that feeling of learning something new, of watching yourself improve in real time, is pretty rare as an adult. We get caught up in our routines, in our day-to-day tasks, in our careers, and we find ourselves following the same path day after day over and over without having to really step out of our comfort zone. We stop putting ourselves in positions where we're going to be bad at something. Being bad at something is required to learn something new. It keeps you humble and open, but it also gives you a confidence that can only come from the experience of growth and not just from being excellent. Now, imagine being an elite athlete, and not just any elite athlete, one of the best in the world at what you do. You've probably been training for years, for decades, probably as long as you can remember. You have been preparing for this moment, and you probably can't remember a time when you weren't very good at what you do. But knitting is different. It gives you a place where you can safely be a beginner, where you can be bad at something, and it's encouraged, it's okay. For someone whose entire life has been about being the best in the world, where tiny mistakes, minuscule margins of error could have career-ending repercussions, trying a craft where making mistakes has almost no consequences at all, you can just rip back and start over, it's no big deal, must feel radical. Knitting showing up in the Olympic Village as a way for athletes to calm their anxious minds shouldn't actually come as that big of a surprise, because people have turned to knitting in times of stress for centuries. During World War I and World War II, often women were stuck at home while men, husbands, and sons were sent off to battle, and it was a helpless feeling to sit at home and wait for any bit of news, worried about the worst possible outcome. The American Red Cross launched national campaigns, Knit Your Bit, Socks for Soldiers, to encourage the women who were left behind at home to knit in order to support the war effort. But it also served an important purpose for the women who were knitting at home. Hundreds of thousands of people picked up their needles, not just to support the war effort, but to feel some sense of control and agency in a situation where the outcome was entirely out of their hands. In times of waiting, in between moments of great stress and pressure, people have always turned to knitting as a way to calm anxious minds, fill their hands, and feel some sense of control over a situation that feels uncontrollable. The current wave of Olympic knitting didn't start with TikTok. Going all the way back to the 2014 Sochi Olympics, the Finnish snowboard team all came equipped with needles and yarn. Their coach thought it would be kind of funny to bring knitting. By the Pyeongchang Olympics in 2018, the media picked up on this phenomenon, and there's a lot of footage of the Finnish snowboard coach knitting at the top of the slopestyle course while his athletes prepared to drop in. Roughly half the Finnish snowboard team was knitting at the Olympics that year, and they all put together squares to assemble into a blanket and gift to the Finnish president for his newly born baby. It started as a little bit of a joke, and then it became something that very effectively filled the time between runs, between competitions, but the media picked up on it because there was something that felt discordant about this image of peak athletes knitting. Despite the history of male knitters, of male knitting guilds in Europe and fishermen knitting during the colder months, there's still a cultural obsession with the image of the knitting grandma. And the knitting grandma is seen as meek, quiet, relaxed, tired, which feels like the opposite of peak athletic performance. So when young, elite, highly visible male athletes pick up knitting, it feels novel, even newsworthy. The contrast between peak athletic performance and a so-called granny hobby is part of the reason that this imagery spreads. The nervous system explains why knitting feels good, why athletes might be picking it up, but it doesn't explain why we're seeing so much of it, because we're not watching these athletes knit in private. It's being broadcast on our television screens. The cameras are searching for athletes knitting in the crowd, and they're making content out of it. Visibility changes the stakes. The Olympics have always created celebrity. Jesse Owens, Nadia Comaneci, Michael Phelps. The spotlight isn't new, but what's new is who controls it. Because up until very recently, there were a lot of systems in place to control who got visibility from the Olympics, who got the brand deals, who wound up on the Wheaties box. For most of Olympic history, converting that visibility into a paycheck required a media partner, a great agent, corporate sponsorship. Media success wasn't in the hands of the athlete. All they had to do was show up and compete. But now, athletes don't need permission to build an audience. They don't need to wait for the Wheaties box or the sneaker deal. All they need is social media and the phone that's in their pocket. And we get to follow along for everything. The swag bags, the best chocolate muffins, the pool, the sound bath, we get to see it all in real time. Olympians get to show themselves as people, not just as performers. Social media humanizes them. And that spotlight is short. It comes every 2 years for about 2 weeks. For many athletes, that's the most concentrated window of attention that they will probably have in their whole life. And so what happens in that window matters. Because in 2026, visibility can be converted into a social media following, into brand partnerships, and into opportunities that can outlast an athletic career. One of the athletes who's been especially vocal about this is Canadian biathlete Adam Runnels. Now, he brought his knitting with him to the Olympic Village. And before he started posting about knitting and the Olympics, he was averaging about 10 to 15,000 views on his videos about preparing for the Olympics, his training routine. But after he started posting about knitting and the Olympic Village, his views skyrocketed. He started getting 500,000, even sometimes close to 1 million views per video, and that difference is not subtle. Over his time competing in the Olympics, knitting has become a prominent part of his social media presence. And in one interview, he said posting about knitting has made him more aware of his personal brand. People aren't just watching the competition, they're watching the athletes as well. And the way that those athletes show up both on screen and on social media can help them build celebrity that they can leverage into future career opportunities. Athletes understand the ecosystem that they're competing in. There's a reason we're getting more and more footage of athletes knitting at the Olympics. That granny stereotype combined with peak physical performance is unexpected, and it stops the scroll. It humanizes people who almost feel mythical, and it feels relatable because we're watching athletes be imperfect at something. Watching someone who is so excellent at what they do be a beginner again is kind of exciting to watch. We get to see that outside of their sport, the thing that we see them the most for, they have hobbies, they have lives, they have other interests, and that makes them more relatable too. We've seen more and more footage of athletes knitting at the Olympics, coming to a new high at the Milano Cortina Winter Olympics, where we saw lots of different athletes knitting and making scarves. But all of them have a blueprint to follow. British diver Tom Daley set a precedent at the Tokyo Olympics. He showed that knitting isn't just a way to calm your nerves, it can also build a platform. Now, I don't think that's what he set out to do. I really do think that Tom picked up knitting to be a calming activity, and he got a lot of unexpected attention for it. He started knitting during lockdown in 2020, he found it was a way to calm his nerves, and he mostly knit in private. But after he was caught knitting in the stands while watching other athletes compete, his media presence blew up. Cameras caught him knitting in the stands between dives, and that image went viral. Within the next 2 weeks, Tom Daley would gain 1 million followers on Instagram. That's huge. He kept knitting, but he also began to build. He launched Made with Love by Tom Daley. He wrote a knitting book. He wound up becoming the host of Game of Wool, knitting show on Channel 4. He collaborated with major yarn brands. He even helped design the knitwear for Team GB for the Milano Cortina Olympics. His Olympic spotlight was temporary, but his audience didn't have to be. If we're going by Instagram following alone, he has now built the largest knitting brand in the world. And that's only a few years after he first learned how to knit. Tom Daley might be the first Olympian in the social media era to utilize an online following to build a brand. The benefits of knitting stand alone, completely isolated from social media. But we're also living in 2026, and it's very possible that athletes who picked up knitting for the calming benefits tried posting about it and noticed that the social media response was massive. If you post about bringing yarn to the Olympic Village and your views skyrocket, that can be hard to ignore. Olympic athletes have trained for their entire life for this moment. They prepared for the physical challenge. But today, you don't just get to be an Olympian. There's also a great pressure to build a social media following while the spotlight is on you. The Olympic window is short, and today, sponsorships and brand deals care almost as much about your social media following as they do about which awards you won. Plus, being an Olympian isn't cheap. Many Olympic athletes work other jobs. They are funding their own training and buying their own gear, even their own bobsleds. That gets really expensive. And retiring from athletics is inevitable, and it often happens young. So there's a lot of pressure to build the strongest following they can to build an off-ramp from their athletic career. Athletes are hyper aware that they need to succeed at social media to secure their future, but most of them aren't social media strategists. They spent all their time training for physical competition. And so they're just figuring it out as they go. And when you post something like knitting and you see that it blows up your feed, you're going to post it again. Plus, I'm sure many of those Olympians have watched Tom Daley build his brand. And once you understand the leverage behind those numbers, it's pretty compelling to build a following yourself. So when you see Olympians knitting in the stands between competitions, it's not just a random, quirky hobby. Knitting steadies the nervous system in an environment built on adrenaline. And it gives elite athletes an opportunity to adopt a beginner mindset again. In an environment where the world's most elite athletes come together, they still need something slow, something to calm the nervous system, something with low stakes, where making mistakes is not just part of the process, it's almost encouraged, that you can rip back out and start over again. In a world of social media and high stakes and stress and elite performance, knitting solves two problems at once. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button to let me know that you enjoyed it. And I'm curious, which of your favorite knitting Olympians did you enjoy following this year? As always, it's been really great to talk about knitting with you today, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.